Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Finding good advice can be tricky when you're an inexperienced writer. Before I had steady access to the internet, I would often peruse writing advice books at Borders, Rest in Peace, and other stores, thinking that I should read as many as I could to improve my craft. And I actually ended up buying a pretty good amount back in the late 2000s and early 2010s, but then I started turning more to the internet for writing advice, which may or may not have been a good idea. While advice was now more accessible, there was also a lot more to sift through. But regardless of where you get your writing advice, there are some common phrases that every aspiring author has heard at some point in their lives. Show don't tell, write every day, prologues are bad, write what you know, establish your protagonist, antagonist, and main conflict by the end of the first chapter, and a novel shouldn't be more than 90 to 100,000 words. On the surface level, these do sound like good pieces of advice. However, as I've grown as a writer, I've come to realize that these are overgeneralizations that are now held up as definitive rules that everyone should follow. But a big problem with these rules is that they can really restrict your creativity. Don't get me wrong, there are definitely rules to writing, but they're not nearly as numerous or inflexible as popular opinion might have you believe, and the same goes for the rules of any other creative medium. So today, I want to take a look at each of these items and discuss why I think they're not really that good of advice without some extra explanations. Starting with show don't tell. Up front, I will say this is a good way to write. It is better to show, which means that your characters are doing and saying things that move the story along, rather than tell, which means you're usually summarizing events. Showing typically roots us better with the characters than telling does. In fantasy and science fiction specifically, telling typically manifests in the form of info dumps. Newer and or inexperienced writers in these genres tend to get really excited about the world building they've been doing, and they want to make sure the reader gets all of that information too. Now, I'm all for fun world building and wanting to share it, but the problem is that the reader doesn't really care as much as you do, at least not in the beginning of your story. We don't really know why it's important for all this information to come out without characters really giving us context for it. But I do think that telling has a time and a place. Telling can be a really great way to explain a passage of time that doesn't need to be on screen, so to say. Maybe your story is about big armies clashing against each other, and the big battles are really the action pieces and they provide the tension for the story. You might not want to spend chapter after chapter describing the daily marching and the upkeep of the army. Instead, you might just summarize all of that information in a tidy paragraph or two early on in a scene, and then you'd actually get to the stuff that is what the scene is really about. And one of my favorite examples of this type of telling is in The Wise Man's Fear by Patrick Rothfuss. The main character, Quoth, however you pronounce it, takes a harrowing journey by ship that takes several months and includes several unfortunate events. But that's not the stuff the story was actually concerned with, and so Rothfuss summarized all of this in a really terrific paragraph, and then the scene picks up 3 months later with Quoth arriving wherever he was supposed to go in the first place. In summary, this advice should really be show first, but tell when appropriate. A good use of telling can provide info without slowing down a story. Just don't go on for pages describing all your cool world building or your setting, and instead show it to us as the characters encounter it. Next up, write every day. Like the last one, I mostly agree with this on the surface level. If your goal is to improve as a writer, you need to be writing frequently, just as you would practice an instrument or a sport. But here's the thing. This blanket piece of advice does not take into account someone's individual goals. Not everyone who writes wants to be published. You might work on a story for 10 years because it's your passion project, and once you're done with that, that might be the only thing you ever actually write. And even if you do want to be a published author, you might have other priorities going on in life right now. You might be working full-time and have a partner and kids that take up most of your time outside of work. I don't think it's too outrageous to say that most people will, or at least probably should, prioritize their family over their hobbies. Now, I would say that if you want to become a full-time published author, then yes, you should make your best effort to write every day, but you also need to take care of yourself and take breaks when you know the words just aren't going to flow. So in summary, this advice should be write every day that you are able. If you can make time to write even a little bit each day, great. But if not, create a schedule that works for your life. And always remember, you can't finish writing your story if you burn yourself out. Next up, prologues are bad. I honestly have no idea where this started, but by golly, do a lot of people think this now. I understand the complaint about prologues that don't feel like they connect to the main story, especially if they have like a POV character who dies at the end of the prologue or in like the next scene in chapter 1. Not every prologue is like that, of course, but now it seems like including any sort of prologue is a big no. Something to remember is that everyone's tastes are different. I absolutely love the prologue to The Eye of the World, and that takes place 3,000 years prior to the present day of the story. And the reason I liked it so much was because it didn't connect to the main part of the story. Instead, it set the tone for the entire series to be a huge sweeping epic. So if you've got a prologue that you like and you think it's necessary for your story, keep it. I guarantee someone will like it. And I feel like I have to add that A Song of Ice and Fire, as well as episode 1 of Game of Thrones in the show, does in fact feature a POV character who dies in a scene that does not connect to the main story until much later on. And that series is pretty popular. In summary, this advice should really be, prologues are only bad if they're done poorly, which really goes for any piece of writing advice. The next one is write what you know. The idea behind this advice is that you are more likely to write better about something with which you are familiar. But this advice, as well as the next two, is a very narrow way of looking at storytelling, as it favors literary fiction more than anything else. I write fantasy. I don't know about you, but I personally don't have any experience with magic or dragons or quests to destroy magic rings or wizards telling me I'm the chosen one and so on. One of the purposes of speculative fiction is to explore things we can't experience here in the real world. Now, you can inject things that you do know about into speculative fiction. For example, if you happen to know a lot about horses, proper horse care would actually be a really good element to include in a fantasy novel, because there's actually a whole trope about horses being treated like motorcycles. If you've got a lot of experience with wilderness survival, you could probably make traveling sequences more believable. Maybe you're a musician and you can use your knowledge to craft more interesting sequences with songs in a story. There are ways to write what you know in speculative fiction, but you certainly shouldn't feel constrained by that. It's way easier nowadays to research basically anything online, so if you have an interest in a topic that is beyond your scope, don't be afraid to do some digging. And so in summary, this advice should be, write what you know, but don't be afraid to expand on what you know. And I'm a firm believer that any author can write about any topic. That does not guarantee they will do it well, but that is up to the reader to decide. The next one on the list is establish your protagonist, antagonist, and main conflict by the end of chapter 1. Again, this is a litfic thing that is now bandied about as being true to every form of writing, and that's kind of silly and constraining. One of the many reasons I like epic fantasy is because I expect a slow burn. I expect to have trickles of information rather than being given everything right at once. So if a fantasy novel were to reveal all of this info right up front in chapter 1, I might actually be turned off of it. Of these items, the only one that you definitely need to establish in chapter 1 is your protagonist. As readers, we do need at least one character to care about and root ourselves in the story, and so we need to know who we're going to be following. But I don't need to know the main conflict or the main antagonist right away at all. And I actually really like first chapters that just kind of establish what the character is like in their regular life, with just enough tension and mystery to show that something is going to happen soon that will upend their world. And that tension in chapter 1 is what we would call the inciting incident. But in fantasy and other longer works, I'd say that there tends to actually be two inciting incidents in the story, one that occurs in that first chapter to engage the reader, and then one that occurs slightly later that establishes the actual main conflict. Using Eye of the World as an example again, in chapter 1, Rand spots a spooky cloaked rider right away, but his father actually can't see the rider. And this inciting incident occurs only a few pages in, and then the tension continues to build as they arrive in town, and Rand learns that only younger people have been able to see this spooky rider. Then for several chapters, we see more of what life is like for Rand and the people of Amon's Field, but there's still this tension as the mystery of the rider is pondered, and we learn about some other strangers in town. But the real inciting incident that kicks off the main plot of the story occurs in chapter 5 when Trollocs attack the town. In the aftermath of the attack, Rand and the others have to flee the two rivers, which is primarily what this story is actually concerned with. So with epic fantasy, I don't really expect to see the true inciting incident until like 3 to 5 chapters in, and while that definitely establishes a conflict of some kind, I don't even necessarily need the main antagonist more than hinted at by that point. Now I will say, if you're writing a shorter, fast-paced thriller sort of story, then definitely err on the side of establishing more information more quickly. But definitely don't feel like you have to do that in a 200,000 word epic fantasy novel. So in summary, this advice should be establish the protagonist and other necessary information according to your genre in the first chapter. And lastly, we have a novel should be no more than 90 to 100,000 words. Once again, this is a lit-fic rule that every internet writing advice column now preaches as gospel. I don't honestly remember the last time I read an epic fantasy novel that was shorter than like 130,000 words, and I would still consider that a short book. This advice especially gets thrown towards new writers trying to break into the market. For epic fantasy, I've sometimes seen the advice get pushed up to 120,000 words, but even then that will probably be too short, depending on the story that you want to tell. For me, I expect a big chunker of a book when it comes to epic fantasy. I don't care whether it's a first book or a fifth book. If it's good, it's good. And often it's good because it's the length the author wanted it to be. Also, I've got plenty of fantasy books that are first published novels for authors here on these shelves that are definitely over 100,000 words. To name a couple examples, Elantris, Promise of Blood, The Ruin of Kings, The Name of the Wind, The Shadow of What Was Lost, The Rage of Dragons, and on and on. Heck, Wizard's First Rule was definitely over 200,000 words. Not that it was very good, of course, but it did make money. My point here is that the word count of a novel is arbitrary. As long as it's above the 70,000 mark or so, it's a novel, not a novella. But there is no upper limit beyond your own creative vision. So in summary, this advice, just like the last one, should really be a novel should be whatever length is appropriate for your genre and for the story you want to tell. And there you have it, 6 common pieces of advice that I think need to be a little more flexible. I struggled for a long time with trying to reconcile these pieces of advice during my writing journey. Once I grew as a writer and became more confident, I decided to start bending these rules, and writing became a lot more fun. And that's really what it comes down to. It's always good to learn the fundamentals of something, but you can't be afraid to push in a direction that goes against conventional wisdom. Well, I think that's all for today. As always, thanks for stopping by my channel. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribe to the channel if you're interested in hearing more of my thoughts on various stories and updates from my own writing journey. Leave a comment below if you agree or disagree with these addendums to the common pieces of writing advice. What rules have you broken in your writing or other preferred creative outlet? Or feel free to just say hello. I post new videos on Sundays. Until next time, I hope that you have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you here in the next video.